2 weeks ago, the British neuroscientist Susan Greenfield warned in the Daily Mail that, quote, social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Bebo are said to shorten attention spans, encourage instant gratification, and make young people more self-centered, end quote. And my first thought upon reading this was exactly what you thought. Bebo? Cool. That's a new one I haven't heard of. I'll have to check it out. Trust me, it's way lamer than Facebook. But my second thought upon completing the article was, it takes a neuroscientist to point this out? Attention deficits, instant gratification, and narcissism, these are the measurable and most obvious effects of almost all electronic media these days. You might even say this is the history of mass media from the printed book forward. Look at the evolution of attention span and its twin, instant gratification. A book takes about 10 hours to read, a good book. A movie takes about 2 hours to watch. A TV show takes about 1 hour. A video game, maybe half an hour. A Facebook update only takes a few minutes. And a Twitter tweet can be measured in seconds. A 140-character limit compels you to keep it short. Whether you're the producer or consumer, the average time needed for consumption and completion is getting shorter and shorter. And look at the state of production and consumption of the old medium, the book, under digital conditions. A prolific writer of the old world was someone like Isaac Asimov, who, using only a typewriter, produced 480 books and died in 1992, before the internet. A really prolific writer was South African writer Mary Faulkner, who actually holds the world's record, as far as I can tell. She wrote 904 books. She died in 1973. Now here we are under digital conditions where every one of us has the means of production that are incredibly efficient, where the keyboard offers less physical resistance to your typing, the spell checker and grammar checker are built in, and you can actually download software to generate your own Harlequin romance novels just by choosing the names of the characters and the locations of their trysts. Under these conditions, the most prolific author we have is someone like Stephen King, who's written 50 novels and who, in his own words, describes his literary output as the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and fries. That's production. Consumption of books for the average American drops to 1 per year after graduating college. So while the tools of production are better, faster, more productive than ever, actual production and output per author is declining, and the definition of prolific is getting less and less. Now, narcissism. With a book, you are the reader, reading about the adventures of the protagonist, which you have to imagine in your mind's eye. In a movie, you get a little closer. You get to see and hear and identify with the protagonist and feel much closer to knowing who he or she really is. In the video game, you actually get to be the protagonist and incarnate his virtual body, wear his armor, and use his weapons to kill the bad guys. And unlike the novel that influenced the other media forms, in the video game, you can choose the setting that says unlimited ammunition and undefeatable. So you never have to lose. Thus, as the media evolve, you naturally come to the conclusion that the world does, in fact, revolve around you and your every whim and emotion from minute to minute. But this problem has not always been with us. Listen to Neil Postman describe the attendees at the Lincoln-Douglas debates a short while ago. Quote, "Who were these people who could so cheerfully accommodate themselves to 7 hours of oratory?" In 1985, Postman asked, "Is there any audience today who could endure 7 hours of talk, or 5, or 3, especially without pictures of any kind?" By 2009, I stopped assigning this book to my students. Instead, I assigned the essay from which it originated. Perhaps in the future, I'll only be able to assign these key quotes. Under conditions of multitasking and perpetual electronic distraction, reading itself becomes a form of monotasking. And people perceive it to be a form of solitary confinement, the worst kind of psychological torture. And so they cope with it the only way they know how, by falling asleep at precisely the moment that their electronic media attention span wears out. Now audiobooks are on the rise because they allow you to multitask while you're quote-unquote reading, but these conditions also retrieve infancy and childhood of mommy or daddy reading you a bedtime story. I believe these over-mediated conditions are a primary causal factor for how it becomes harder and harder for people to actually discern, let alone confirm, God's will for their lives. And as a result, they are constantly on edge about embracing it. In a 2003 lecture, the late Michael Crichton said that the greatest challenge facing mankind is the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. He said, perceiving the truth has always been a challenge to mankind, But in the information age, or as I think of it, the disinformation age, it takes on a special urgency and importance. Crichton was referring, of course, to the media and how one could know whether to trust what you saw, read, or heard. Under conditions of global technology and democracy, where every party has vested interests, it's easier to become suspicious about motive. And so it's easier to take all news as opinion and all opinions as equally valuable, which is the same as taking them all as worthless. Which is why I think your generation gets its news primarily from The Onion or Jon Stewart's Daily Show, because those outlets deliver the illusion of trustworthiness by presenting the mainstream media as fundamentally untrustworthy. And of course, the more successful these satirical news shows become, the more they get purchased by and become a subset of the mainstream media. So if we care about what we take into our mouths, we should also care about our media diets, about what we take into our minds, which makes a remix of 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13 potentially useful. Instead of food, consider media. Now, concerning media offered to gods other than Jesus Christ, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge from Google puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something from Wikipedia, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the watching of movies and staring at the screen of the TV and computer for 12 hours per day, we know that a visual medium has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Steven Spielberg and George Lucas may be so-called gods, and as indeed there are many who have now achieved celebrity status in film or simulated celebrity status on Facebook, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. However, not all possess this knowledge because it cannot be found in a 10-second search on Google. But some, through former association with media, devote their time and energy to media as though it were a worthy sacrifice, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Media will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not watch, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours, yea, even this high-bandwidth digital cornucopia of yours, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you, who have knowledge, consuming media in a celebrity hotspot, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to also consume the media of American idolatry? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if media makes my brother stumble into pornography and masturbation, or makes my sister stumble into body image anxiety, cutting, and depression, I will never consume media, lest I make my brother or sister stumble. All media are permissible. Not all media are beneficial. Wheaton College banned movies for 72 years after they were invented, until they began to allow them in 1967. Just 40 years later, they put a large screen projector into chapel. What was once a mistrusted medium of communication, images, and especially moving, talking images, suddenly became a requirement for worship. So while it's a nice thing to not have to squint to see the speaker when you're sitting in the audience, and while the song lyrics on screen are much more legible than the old overhead projector system, it does also bring up the question of what kind of challenge this poses to religious practice. As Neil Postman put it, in the second commandment, the one forbidding images, it's a strange injunction to include as part of an ethical system unless its author assumed a connection between the forms of human communication and the quality of a culture. I'm told that students in the balcony especially appreciate the video screen because it helps them pay attention, helps them because they can see the facial movements of the speaker. And this may indeed be a social good, but if chapel is a place of worship, one question we might ask is whether it helps us to hear God. Listening requires the practice of listening, just as music requires the practice of music. Video screens may condition us to be willing to listen only if we can tolerate looking, which is an effect that has already completely transformed the music industry and is why all your pop stars are so hot and can't sing very well, whereas the old pop stars weren't very good looking but could sing beautifully.